So in the previous videos, we saw that having a context lifespan which is more than one was causing a couple of issues. The first is it wasn't letting the intent that we expected to be mapped, and it was also causing the intents we did not want to get mapped to actually get triggered, right? So this means that having a context lifespan which is more than one was leading to some unpredictable behavior in your chatbot. So let's take a look at this in some more detail and see if we can come up with a more systematic way to study the whole problem, and as well as see if we can come up with some heuristics and see if we can make our bots more predictable by following certain conventions. So the first thing I want to talk about is the notion of the candidate intents. What do I mean by candidate intents? At any given point in the conversation, there are a certain set of intents which can fire. Now, we already know that if an intent has an input context, unless that context is active, it's not possible for that intent to fire at that point in the conversation. Now, what this also means is that if you have an intent which has no input context, it means it can fire at any point during the conversation, which means it's a candidate intent at every point in the conversation. And you also know that if the input context of that intent is active at that point in the conversation, it's possible for that intent to fire, which means it will be a candidate intent at that point in the conversation. Now, to make it a little more concrete, let's take a look at the bot we've been building, and let's just look at it at the starting point. So here we already know that the default fallback, the default welcome don't have any input context. We know that these two are context based fallbacks, which means that they do have input context. And we also know, based on the previous videos, that user provides first name and user provides last name will have input context. User wants to buy island won't have an input context, so it's a candidate intent at the first step in the conversation. And the same way, user wants to buy submarine has no input context, but these two follow-up intents will have input context, and these two cannot trigger at the starting of the conversation. Now, there is another way to study this. I have built an app called the Dialogflow Navigator. So the Dialogflow Navigator allows you to take the zip file of your agent and filter the intents by input and output context. So here you have, it can also do like a search within and all that, but for now we are only concerned with the context. And you can see that it's basically, as soon as you load the zip file, it's going to show you all the details of each intent. You have the intent name and the input context, the output context, and then you have like actions and so forth. And then you have on the two columns on the right, you have the user says phrases as well as the responses. Now you see at the top here, there is a way to filter by input context. So what I'm going to do is, you can see that you can either choose all the intents, or you can choose the input context, the intents which have input context none, that is, they don't have any input context. So let's say I select that, and this list has changed, and you can see that it's come back to the list I was just talking about. You have the default fallback, the default welcome, the user wants to buy island, and the user wants to buy submarine. So these intents are the ones which do not have an input context, and they are the candidate intents at the very first step of the conversation. Now let's say that at this point the user says, I want to buy a submarine. So it's going to trigger this user wants to buy submarine intent, and it's also going to set this user wants to buy submarine hyphen follow-up context. So this is now active at this point in the conversation. So let's take a look at which intents can actually fire. So we are looking at this context over here. Let's select that, and you can see that these are the two intents which can now fire. It's the first name fallback intent as well as the user wants to buy submarine hyphen first name intent. So these are the two intents which can fire at this point in the conversation. But I also want you to remember one more thing. The input context, whether it's active or not, also matters. So what do I mean by that? Like if I go back here and I say that if I just give my first name, let's say I use the usual, the Adam. So what you see here is the user wants to buy submarine hyphen follow-up is still active, and you can see that the user wants to buy submarine hyphen first name hyphen follow-up is also active. So effectively what this means for us is if either this or this context is active, if this or this context, whatever intents are using them as the input context, they're all going to be candidate intents at that point in the conversation. So when I move this to user wants to buy submarine first name follow up, you can see that now we have these two intents, last name fallback and user wants to buy submarine hyphen last name. But remember that this context is also still active, which means these two intents, the first name fallback and the user wants to buy submarine, are also candidates. So if I come back to this list here, what I just told you is at this step in the conversation, user wants to buy submarine hyphen last name is active because of this context. Okay, last name fallback is a candidate intent because of this context, but first name fallback is also a candidate intent because this context is still active. And in the same way, user wants to buy submarine hyphen first name is a candidate intent because this context is active. In other words, you can take a look at the active context from this in the Dialogflow simulator over here, and based on that you will be able to look at this list and figure out which of these intents are candidates. And don't forget, at every step we still have these fallback and the welcome and the user wants to buy island, user wants to buy submarine. All these are also still candidate intents simply because they don't have an input context. So the other way to look at it is, if an input context is set, that can still trigger intents which don't have any input context at all set. In other words, like I said before, the intents which don't have any input context will be candidate intents at every step in the conversation. Now that actually has some benefits. For example, you want the fallback to always be active, to always be a candidate at every step, because if you can't handle it, then you certainly you want the fallback to get triggered. But it also means that you have to be careful when you create intents which don't have input context, because you want to be pretty sure that they will not be conflicting with the other intents which you want to actually fire at that point in the conversation. So that's a quick overview. I hope you got a good idea of what makes a candidate intent at each step in the conversation. We will be building on top of this the notion of candidate intents in the upcoming videos.